Entity transaction in Jakarta persistence. Focusing on entity transaction, each entity manager has one-to-one relation with a single Jakarta.persistent.entity transaction. The entity transaction interface is used to control resource transaction on resource local entity managers. The entity manager.get transaction method returns an instance of the entity transaction interface. As an example, we can consider interface entity transaction. Interface used to control a transaction on resource local entity managers. The entity manager.get transaction method returns the entity transaction interface. This is in module Jakarta.persistence and package Jakarta.persistence. As an example too, we can consider this code segment. The following example illustrate the creation of an entity manager factory in a Java SE environment, and it's used in creating and using resource local entity manager. We are considering this here entity transactions. Here you can see the get transaction method returns the resource level entity transaction object. The entity transaction instance may be used serially to begin and commit multiple transactions. Here you can see a begin method in interface entity transaction. This starts a resource transaction. Here you can see a commit method. Commit the current resource transaction, writing any unflushed changes to the database. Now we are considering entity transaction interface in entity managers and persistence context with regard to controlling transactions. If the entity transaction commit operation fails, the persistent provider must roll back to the transaction. The interface entity transaction in package Jakarta.persistence in module Jakarta.persistence. Interface is used to control transactions on the resource local entity managers. The entity manager.get transaction method returns the entity transaction interface. The entity transaction interface is used to control resource transaction on resource local entity managers. The entity manager.get transaction method returns an instance of the entity transaction interface. When the resource local entity manager is used, the persistent provider runtime throws an exception defined to cause transaction rollback. The persistent provider must mark the transaction for rollback. If the transaction.commit operation fails, persistent provider must roll back the transaction. Now we are considering persistence context lifetime and synchronization type in entity operations. Synchronization with the current now we are considering synchronization with the current transaction. By default, the container managed persistent context is of synchronization type .synchronize and is automatically joined to the current transaction. NM synchronization type in package Jakarta.persistence in module Jakarta.persistence specifies whether the persistent context is always automatically synchronized with the current transaction or whether the persistent context must be explicitly joined to the current transaction by the means of the entity manager.join transaction method. By default, a container managed persistent context is of synchronization type .synchronize and is automatically joined to the current transaction. A persistent context of a synchronization type dot unsynchronized will not be enlisted in the current transaction unless the entity manager join transaction method invoke. By default, an application managed persistent context is associated with the JTA entity manager, and that is created within the scope of an active transaction is automatically joined to the transaction. An application managed JTA persistent context that is created outside the scope of a transaction, or an application managed persistent context of type synchronization.unsynchronized will not be joined to the transaction unless the entity manager join transaction method is invoked. An application managed persistent context associated with the resource local entity manager is always automatically joined to any resource local transaction that is begun for entity manager. Now we are considering transaction commit. The managed entities of a transaction is called persistent context before become detached when the transaction commits. The managed entities of an extended persistent context remain managed. Now we are considering transaction rollback. For both transaction scope persistent context and for extended persistent context that are joined to the current transaction, transaction rollback causes all pre-existing managed instances and removed instances to become detached. The instances state will be state of the instances at the point at which the transaction knows rollback. Transaction rollback typically causes the persistent context to be in the consistent state at the point of rollback. In particular, the state of the version of attributes and generated state, for example, generated primary keys, may be inconsistent. Instances that were formerly managed by the persistent context, including new instances that were made persistent in the transaction, may therefore not be reusable in the same manner as other detached objects. For example, they may fail when passed to an merge operation. Because transaction is scoped persistent context lifetime is scoped to the transaction regardless of whether it is joined to the transaction. The container closes the persistent context upon transaction rollback. However, an extended persistent context that is not joined to the transaction is unaffected by transaction rollback. Now we are considering container managed transaction scoped persistent context in container managed persistent context in entity manager's persistent context. The persistent context type for the entity manager is defaulted or defined as a persistent context type transaction. Public static final context type transaction, persistent context type transaction in enum persistent context type in package Jakarta.persistent in module Jakarta.persistence. Transaction is called persistent context. An application can obtain container managed entity manager with the transaction is called persistent context by injecting or direct lookup in the JNDI namespace. The persistent context type for the entity manager is defaulted or defined as persistent context type transaction. New persistent context begins with, when the container managed entity manager is invoked in the scope of an active JTA transaction and the no current persistent context is already associated with the JTA transaction. Persistent context is created and then associated with the JTA transaction. This association of the persistent context with the JTA transaction is independent of the synchronization type of the persistent context, whether the persistent context has been joined to the transaction. Persistent context ends when the associated JTA transaction commit or rollback, and entities that were managed by the entity manager become detached. If the entity manager is invoked outside the scope of a transaction, any entities loaded from the database will immediately become detached at the end of the method call. Here's now we are considering an examples. Here you can see the container managed transaction is called persistent context. Now we are considering application managed persistent context with the resource transaction. Here the application managed for persistent context example here. Here usage in an ordinary Java class. Here transaction begin. Commit. Now we are considering transaction type attributes in persistent.xml file in persistent unit packaging in entity packaging. Transaction type attribute is used to specify whether the entity managers provided by the entity manager factory for the persistent unit must be JTA entity or resource local entity managers. The value of this element is JTA or resource underscore local. The transaction type JTA assumes that the JTA data source will be provided either as specified by the JTA data source element or provided by the container. In general, the Jakarta EE environments, the transaction type of resource underscore local assumes that the non-JTA database data source will be provided. In Jakarta E environment, this element is not if this element is not specified, the default is JTA. In Java SE environment, if this element is not specified, the default is resource underscore local. Example, we can consider this one, illegal state exception. If isActive method is true in method void begin in interface entity transaction. Now we